Hi, everyone. I would like to read a short excerpt from the English philosopher Simon Critchley's book, The Book of Dead Philosophers. First, just a word about the book, in case you're interested in getting a copy for yourself. I quite like the book, and I would recommend it to you if you're interested in philosophy. The blurb just goes like this. In this collection of brief lives and deaths of nearly 200 of the world's greatest thinkers, noted philosopher Simon Critchley creates a register of mortality that is tragic, amusing, absurd, and exemplary. So he briefly tells the life stories of about 200 philosophers, their main ideas, so you get a general idea of what they thought and what they taught, and how they died. Okay. From the self-mocking haikus of Zen masters on their deathbeds to the last words of Christian saints and modern-day sages, this irresistible book contains much to inspire both amusement and reflection. So if you get this book and read it, you'll never be bored, and you'll learn something too. So two good things. Aristotle would say that this book is better than others for these two reasons. It entertains and informs. Informed by Critchley's acute insight, scholarly intelligence, and sprightly wit, each entry tells its own tale, but collected together, they add up to a profound and moving investigation of meaning and the possibility of happiness for all. So I will recommend you get this book, but in the meantime, I will be reading a short excerpt from it. Also, we'll just have a quick look at the table of contents, and you can see all of these names, all these philosophers. It's a little intimidating to see so many names, but you don't have to just sit and read the book. You can browse, right? Look up, for example, if you're just interested in the deaths of Christian saints, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them. You can just read about them, and then you can move on to some other place. Books are like time travel. We talk about that often in this class, right? They allow us to visit different people in different centuries and see what they had to say and get to know them a little bit. These deaths of philosophers are 190. Okay, I said earlier 200. 190 or so dead philosophers. These are mostly in chronological order. However, there is one exception. Socrates, right? The most famous of all philosophers, the greatest of all philosophers, probably. He gets his own section right at the beginning because his death is very significant. In fact, Critchley will say that the death of Socrates is the real beginning of philosophy. That's not exactly right, but I mean, these philosophers, right? The pre-Socratics means before Socrates. So all of these philosophers came before Socrates. Anyway, we're going to be reading Learning How to Die, Socrates together, where it describes the death of Socrates in Critchley's own retelling, but also some of the ideas that Socrates taught. Okay, so let's have a look. Philosophy is conventionally considered to begin with the trial and death of Socrates, who was condemned to death on the trumped-up charges of Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon. These were all prominent Athenians who did not like being, questioned by the likes of Socrates, who was a nobody in their eyes. There were two charges leveled against him: corrupting the youth of Athens and failing to revere the city's gods. In Plato's account, there was also a third charge, namely that Socrates introduced his own new gods. Whatever the truth of the latter accusation, Socrates always claimed to follow his own demon, what Cicero, the poet, called a divine something, a personal god or spirit, what we might be inclined to think of as conscience. However, Critchley said, Socrates' demon was not some inner voice, but an external sign or command that would suddenly cause him to stop in his tracks. And Socrates will say during his trial that the reason he went for his trial, even though it ended up resulting in him being condemned to death, was the fact that his demon didn't stop him, right? If I wasn't supposed to be here, my demon would have stopped me. But he didn't stop me, so here I am. Socrates' death is sometimes seen as the political show trial, as the political show trial and execution of an innocent dissident at the hands of a tyrannical state. Let me read that again. Socrates' death is sometimes seen as the political show trial and execution of an innocent dissident at the hands of a tyrannical state. However, it should not be forgotten that Socrates counted some pretty reactionary characters among his followers. Socrates' pupil Critias was the leader of the 30 tyrants' anti-democratic reign of terror from 404 to 403 BCE. It should also be remembered that according to Xenophon, who's Xenophon, you might be wondering. By the way, Critchley names a lot of people. You don't have to know them all. But Xenophon is important because he was another student of Socrates, just like Plato. In fact, we can, there's a whole section in his Wikipedia page. Oh, here, Socratic's work and dialogues. Here, it says Xenophon's works include a selection of Socratic dialogues. These are like transcripts of conversations that Socrates had. These writings are preserved, except for the dialogues of Plato. They are the only surviving representatives of the genre of Socratic dialogue. So, just as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the words of Jesus down so that we have them right after his life and death and resurrection, um, Xenophon and Plato wrote down what Socrates had to say so that we have access to it in our time, right? Jesus didn't write anything down, right? Neither did Socrates. But thanks to Plato and Xenophon, we have access to what Socrates said. Okay. I will try not to go off topic too much, but I do have one other person I'm going to refer to show you. It should also be remembered that, according to Xenophon, the only time that Socrates advised one of his disciples to enter politics, the recipient was a reluctant Charmides, another of the 30 tyrants who died on the battlefield alongside Critias. Finally, Alcibiades, the handsome, charismatic, and dissolute aristocrat who bursts drunk into Plato's symposium, defected from Athens to the enemy on 2 occasions. Once to the Spartans and again to the Persians. Socrates, especially in the version given by Plato in the Republic, is hardly a fan of democracy, and his teaching could justifiably be seen as fomenting disillusion with democracy among right-wing aristocrats. This guy, Alcibiades, the handsome, charismatic aristocrat, was also a general, and there is a famous painting of Socrates teaching Alcibiades. Here it is, painted in 1777 by Francois-André Vincent, and that's Alcibiades with the helmet and Socrates, recognizable. We know what Socrates looked like, even though there were no cameras back then. And maybe this is actually Socrates' demon on his shoulder. Maybe. I'm not 100% sure, but I have reason to think that it is. Okay. I don't need these anymore. Let's go back. Plato devotes no fewer than 4 dialogues to the events surrounding Socrates' trial and death. They are 𝘉𝘉𝘠, the Apology, Crito, and Phaedo. And if you take all of my classes, you will get to read all of them. I don't do all 4 in any one particular class. I spread them out a bit. If you take my world religions class or my ethics class, you will see 𝘉𝘉𝘠. If you take my intro to philosophy class, you will get to read the Apology. If you take my ethics class, you will get to read the Credo. And if you take my ethics class, you will also, let me do that one more time. If you take my ethics class, you will get to read Credo and Phaedo, right? Parts of it, not the whole thing, just the death of Socrates. And in addition, we have the Memorabilia and Apology of Xenophon, because Xenophon wrote dialogues recounting Socrates' conversations too. In the Phaedo, which is commonly seen as the latest of Plato's 4 dialogues, and the Phaedo is where we read about the death of Socrates, Socrates' words become suffused with Plato's Pythagorean belief in the immortality of the soul. But the earlier Apology gives a rather different view of the matter. Socrates says that death is not at all an evil, but on the contrary, a good thing. Let me read that one more time. Socrates says that death is not at all an evil, but on the contrary, a good thing. That said, death is one of 2 possibilities. Socrates says either it is annihilation and the dead have no consciousness of anything, or, as we are told, it is really a change, a migration of the soul from this place to another, like the underworld, as the Greeks imagined the afterlife. But Socrates insists that, regardless of which of these possibilities is true, right, death as sort of a sleep, an eternal sleep that you never wake up from, or as a journey to another place, death is not something to be feared. If it is annihilation, then it is a long, dreamless sleep, and what could be more pleasant than that? Socrates actually says he enjoys sleeping, so to sleep forever, it's not so bad, right? Could be worse. But if you enjoy sleeping, so much the better. If it is a passage to another place, namely Hades, then that is also something to be wished, as we will meet old friends and Greek heroes and be able to converse with the poets Homer, who wrote the Odyssey, which is, at the time of this recording, a movie that is about to come out, directed by Christopher Nolan. Hesiod, I'm dating this video by saying that, but it's on my mind right now. Hesiod, another poet, and the rest of the immortal company. Just a quick note, Hades, we often think of that as like being hell, right? The place you don't want to go, the bad place, quote unquote, when you die. But the Greeks didn't see it that way. Hades was sort of this place everybody went to. Everybody went there, the good and the bad. The only exceptions were the heroes who went to a place called the Elysian Fields or Elysium. But that was a very, very, very small minority, and only a handful of people ever got to do that. Most of us would all end up in the same place. But Socrates says it won't be so bad because everyone will be there, right? All the people you ever wanted to see, all your loved ones, you get to see them all again in Hades, so it won't be so bad. There is another story told of Socrates that when a man told him, "The 30 tyrants have condemned you to death," he replied, "And nature them." Which, this is worth thinking about, by the way. I think I might actually have a question about this for you at some point, but let me just read it again. I'll pause just a minute to think about it, and then I'm going to move on. There is another story told of Socrates that when a man told him, "The 30 tyrants have condemned you to death," he replied, "And nature them." Socrates likewise turns the tables on his accusers and jury, asserting that they should face death with confidence. Having been condemned to death, Socrates concludes his speech with the following extraordinary words. Now it is time that we were going. Let me start over. Now it is time that we were going. I to die and you to live, and which of us has the happier prospect is unknown to anyone but God. These words encapsulate the classical philosophical attitude towards death. It is nothing to be feared. On the contrary, it is that in relation to which life must be lived. Socrates' enigmatic last words, "Credo, we ought to offer a cock to Asclepius." Cock means rooster, by the way. We ought to offer a rooster to Asclepius, articulate the view by offer sacrifice. We're going to sacrifice a rooster to Asclepius. This articulates the view that death is the cure for life. Okay? Asclepius was the god of healing, and the offering of a sacrifice was something that people suffering from an ailment would offer before sleep in the hope of waking up cured. Thus, death is a curative slumber. Think about it. Life makes us sick, right? Living people get hurt. So death is sort of the cure to life. We won't get sick or hurt anymore after we die. So he's going to offer a rooster to the god of healing on the night before he dies. What must be, or actually, he wants his friend Credo to offer the rooster after he's dead. Okay, anyway. What must be emphasized in Socrates' attitude towards death in the Apology is that although death might be either of the two possibilities discussed, we do not know which one is right. Either death is an eternal sleep, or death is a journey to another place. We don't know which one it is. It has to be one or the other. That is, philosophy is learning how to die, but that which is learnt is not knowledge. This is an essential point. What philosophy teaches is not some quantifiable sum of knowledge that can be bought or sold like a commodity in the marketplace. Such is the business of the sophists, Gorgias, Prodicus, Protagoras, Hippias, and the rest, whose views Socrates relentlessly dismantles in Plato's dialogues. Who are all these people you want to know? Well, Critchley is going to tell us, so don't worry. Incidentally, Gorgias is another dialogue that if you take my critical thinking class, we will read together. Okay, anyway, although Socrates is himself described as a sophist by the lampooning Aristophanes in the Clouds. Aristophanes was a comedian who lived back in Socrates' time, and he wrote these humorous plays, and he wrote one making fun of Socrates called The Clouds. The sophists were a class of professional educators that appeared in the 5th century BCE who offered instruction to young men and public displays of eloquence in return for a fee. Basically, they taught people how to be public speakers and great debaters. The sophists were masters of eloquence, honey-tongued, as Philostratus, a biographer, writes, who traveled from city to city offering, oh no, Philostratus was a sophist himself, sorry. Honey-tongued, as Philostratus writes. He lived during the Roman period of ancient Greece, so like a couple of centuries after Socrates, who traveled from city to city offering knowledge in exchange for money. And the knowledge that they offered was basically how to be a good public speaker, right? So tricks of persuasion. In opposition to the charismatic and often colorfully dressed sophists who came promising knowledge, the poorly attired and rather ugly Socrates only seems to embody a weak paradox. There's nothing flashy or special about Socrates. He wasn't even a very good-looking man, right? So he had a harder time getting people on his side, especially because he was really annoying with all the questions and his contrary personality, right? On one hand, Socrates is declared the wisest man in Greece by the oracle at Delphi. On the other hand, Socrates always insists that he knows nothing. The one thing I know, he said, is that I know nothing. How, therefore, can the wisest man in the world know nothing? This seeming paradox evaporates when we learn to distinguish wisdom from knowledge and become lovers of wisdom. In other words, philosophers. For example, in the Republic, the object of inquiry is justice. What is justice, asks Socrates, and various more or less conventional views of justice are discussed, right? Justice as fairness, for example, dismantled and dismissed. Justice as revenge, right, against your enemies, too. But in the central books of the Republic, Socrates does not give his interlocutors, his conversation partners, an answer to the question of justice or some theory of justice. Instead, we are given a series of stories, most famously the story of the cave, the myth of the cave, that indicate to us indirectly the matter at hand. The path to justice, we are told, is only to be followed by orienting the soul towards the good, which is precisely not a matter of knowledge, but a work of love. Philosophy begins, then, with the questioning of certainties in the realm of knowledge and the cultivation of a love of wisdom. Philosophy is erotic, not just epistemic. Okay, epistemic deals with knowledge. Now, in the Greek understanding of eroticism, it was an all-consuming desire, right? So I don't just want to know, I want to possess. There has never been a more important time to emphasize this distinction between philosophy and sophistry. We are surrounded by countless new sophistries. Televangelists offer authoritative knowledge of the true word of God. This should be in scare quotes, by the way, the true word of God, and perform miraculous cures in exchange for appropriate donations to the cause. An entire new age industry has arisen where knowledge with a capital K of something called self with a capital S is traded in expensive, brightly colored wrappings. I am writing, Critchley says, I am writing these lines on West Sunset Boulevard, Los Angeles, not far from the palatial, like palace-like self-realization center, complete with lavish gardens, a lake shrine, Hindu kitsch architecture, and extensive programs for improving spiritual self-knowledge and communion with God. All right, I decided I wanted to actually look at this self-realization center that Simon Critchley is talking about. So I went to Google Maps and let's have a look. Oh, here it is. Self-Realization Fellowship on Sunset Boulevard. Oh, yeah. Okay, this is the palace-like building where for a fee, you can improve yourself. Okay. Okay, and here's an image of it. Okay, so that's the place that Simon Critchley is talking about. All right, that's interesting. Okay, I think Critchley says, I think it is fair to say, let me start over. Critchley thinks it is fair to say that Western societies, and not just one more time. Critchley thinks it is fair to say that Western societies, and not just Western societies, are experiencing a deep meaning gap that risks broadening into an abyss. Okay, now this is well worth thinking about, and I had trouble getting started on this sentence, but it's important, I think, to read it one more time and think about what he's saying. Critchley thinks it is fair to say that Western societies, and not just Western societies, are experiencing a deep meaning gap that risks broadening into an abyss. And this book was written in 2008, which was, some time ago at this point. So I'm just wondering how much worse it is now. This gap is being filled by various forms of obscurantism, like distractions that conspire. And there are so many more distractions now than there were in 2008, I can tell you that. This gap is being filled by various distractions that conspire to promote the belief that first, such a thing as self-knowledge is attainable, second, that it comes with a price tag, and third, it is completely consistent with the pursuit of wealth, pleasure, and personal salvation. By contrast, Socrates never claimed to know, never promised knowledge to others, and crucially, never accepted a fee. Socrates was actually very poor, which is why he couldn't bribe the jury, right? And got sentenced to death. What this desire for certainty betrays is a profound terror of death and an overwhelming anxiety to be quite sure that death is not the end, but the passage to the afterlife. True, if eternal life has an admission price, then who wouldn't be prepared to pay it? By way of contrast, it is striking to go back to Socrates and his skepticism. He does not simply give voice to an uncertainty with regard to life after death, but also raises the question of which is preferable, life or death. I'm just going to read this one more time. By way of contrast, it is back to Socrates and his skepticism. He does not certainty with regard to life after death, but also raises the question of which is preferred death, because Socrates actually says we don't know that death is bad, right? No one who died has ever come back to tell us that it's bad. Maybe the reason no one comes back after dying is because it's so good no one wants to come back. We don't know, right? The one thing I know is that I know nothing. I do not even know that death is bad. The philosopher is the lover of wisdom who does not claim to know, but who expresses a radical doubt with regard to all things, even with regard to whether life or death is the better state. Okay, there's another good question here as well. The philosopher is the lover of wisdom who does not claim to know. Like, what does that even mean? That is another thing I would love to ask you all about. I will probably make a question about this one too. I haven't made my questions yet at the time of this recording. I'll just read this one more time. The philosopher is the lover of wisdom who does not claim to know, but who expresses a radical doubt with regard to all things, even with regard to whether life or death is the better state. Only God knoweth, as a slightly more antique translation of Socrates' final words at his trial runs. Indeed, Diogenes Laertius was a biographer of philosophers. I don't know that he did any philosophy himself, but he wrote down the lives and ideas of many philosophers so that we could refer back to them. In many ways, this book is sort of like the works that Diogenes Laertius wrote. Indeed, Diogenes Laertius, author of the hugely influential Lives of Eminent Philosophers from the 3rd century AD, tells, or CE if you prefer, tells a fascinating story of Thales, usually considered the first philosopher. He lived a couple of centuries before Socrates. He's the one that fell into the well, if you know that story. He held there was no difference between life and death. Why then, said one, do you not die? Because, said Thales, there is no difference. To be a philosopher, then, is to learn how to die. It is to begin to cultivate the appropriate attitude towards death. As Marcus Aurelius, and I do want to mention Marcus Aurelius to you as well, he's one of my favorite writers. He was the emperor of Rome, but he was also a philosopher. He's called the Philosopher King. Well worth reading. His book, The Meditations, is one of my favorites. I say this often. Carl Sagan told us that writing is magic because it allows the dead to live again. And I always tell my students in my class, the dead will speak to us. And Marcus Aurelius's book, The Meditations, is a wonderful example. It's basically his diary, right? Back in the 2nd century, Marcus Aurelius kept a diary of his thoughts at the end of each day. And almost 2,000 years later, those thoughts, they continue. Aurelius died a long time ago, but his thoughts, they still live. They live in his book. And when we read his book, Marcus Aurelius and Socrates, when we read Plato, they are reincarnated. They live again in our minds, right? Whenever we read what they had to say. And so Marcus Aurelius is a prime example of what Sagan was talking about when he said that writing is a kind of immortality, the immortality of writers, right? Okay, anyway, sorry, I got distracted. To be a philosopher, then, is to learn how to die. It is to begin to cultivate the appropriate attitude towards death. As Marcus Aurelius writes, it is one of the noblest functions of reason to know whether it is time to walk out of the world or not. Unknowing and uncertain, the philosopher walks. Thank you so much for staying with me through all of this.